Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
I'm Wayne Cowan, and you're listening to another Attitude ADHD Experts webinar. Today's webinar is devoted to the many parents looking to improve their child's ability to communicate with their peers, coaches, parents, everyone, frankly. Social skills improvement is high on the list of many parents' wishes for their kids. The problem is few of us know how to help our kids become better conversationalists. As you will find out, though, being able to master the give and take of conversation is key to academic success. Core standards expect kids to be able to do collaborative work, and conversation is key to working together successfully. Our expert today, Anna Vagin, will give parents and teachers tips and strategies for helping kids sharpen and support their social thinking. She has a private practice in Marin County, California, consults with parents and schools in developing plans for improving social cognition, and speaks about the topic in the U.S. and Canada. She's the author of Movie Time Social Learning and UQ Feelings, online video viewing for social learning. Also, today's sponsor of this week's Attitude webinar is Play Attention. Play Attention is the only brain training system that combines both advanced neurofeedback and cognitive training to effectively improve attention, processing, behavior, and learning skills in children and adults with ADHD. Improvement in these areas can help you or your child develop better communication skills. Play Attention can customize a program for you. Contact them at 800-788-6786 or www.playattention.com. So I'll turn it over to Anna now, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I'm so happy to be here this afternoon to talk about conversation, not just because it's important socially, but also because conversation is really important to academic success, particularly with the new core curriculum state standards that are in place, because these standards basically assume conversation skills. And so what does that mean? It means that it's assumed that students can ask and answer questions, retell stories, which is also narrative, of course, engage in collaborative discussions, and that's one of the big things we'll be talking about today, is what are the components of that and how we as parents and therapists and teachers can work to improve that, and also summarize key ideas. So conversation skills then will show themselves across the day, not just on the blacktop, but also during show and tell, during English literature, during debates, during science class. And so it's really happening all through the day. What do we know about students with ADHD in conversation? Well, frankly, we know that they may have a tendency to blurt out, to butt in, to monopolize conversations and discussions, that they often will get distracted. And frankly, they're often too busy organizing their own thoughts that they're planning to say to be able to process what other students are saying and to keep up with the other side of conversation. One of the big issues, as I said, in the core curriculum state standards is the whole idea of collaborative discussions, because a lot of times what teachers are now wanting is to have that group discussion, that back and forth. Let's look at what that involves. Well, it involves listening and going with the group, being able to clarify our ideas when other people don't understand them, and being able to do that without getting too emotionally engaged and too upset and too frustrated that perhaps we weren't understood the first time. But collaboration also means taking that back step, taking a breath and being able to go along with someone else's idea, recognizing that other people are kind of sharing the process of a discussion or a project. Of course, I also already talked a little bit about how we have to manage our own strong feelings, but understand that other people have feelings also, and that we need to be considerate and to be able to recognize, whether it's through intonation or through nonverbal behavior, how people express to us how they're feeling. Collaboration obviously involves sharing the job and being flexible, but also being patient and trusting that the other people are going to do their part of it. And of course, being resilient and being able to stay with the idea and the discussion without giving up, without that frustration. So lots of different concepts underlie and skills underlie conversation. So let's start on the left-hand side of the slide with more the language bases that we're talking about. So you have to be able to process language. You have to have a certain level of receptive language. You have to be able to have complex language. And one of the things when I talk about narrative development and language in general is that we really want students developing complex language, being able to use those conjunctions of because and if and so, because to explain anything that's complicated, whether it's a social event that happened or whether we're talking about a historical period, a historical event, we need to have complex language to be able to explain our viewpoint and what we're talking about. Of course, language, conversation, and organization are a key with executive function difficulties to be able to organize how we're expressing our idea clearly. Then to be able to have that nonverbal understanding and processing of emotions and indirectness, the ability to infer what people might be saying in their conversation is also important. So if we think about what are the social cognitive elements in conversation, certainly perspective taking is important to be able to recognize that the other person is speaking from their perspective, from their experience, and we need to be aware of where they're coming from. So either we can explain more in our conversation or that we can understand where they're coming from. That also is going to involve flexibility and that ability to think, well, I've said this and now you're saying something different. I can be open to your ideas also. Of course, that means that you have to have been paying attention to have heard their idea. And we'll talk a little bit this afternoon about the importance of working with students. You have to really listen to what the other person is saying. You can't just kind of let them talk and really think about where you're going to take your response, your turn. So this obviously falls under executive function when we're talking about organization, empathy, managing our anxiety if we're anxious going into a conversation or a collaborative discussion, if we're feeling that there may be too many people involved in the conversation, it may be difficult for us to track it, to keep up with, well, who's talking now? That may make a student more anxious. Then they have a whole nother thing they're dealing with. They have to work on regulation and using their regulating tools to manage their anxiety. So we can see that very quickly things get complicated, even though when we first think about conversation, we may think, well, that's a relatively simple process. One person talks and then the other person talks. But in reality, conversation is very, very complicated. As we talk about conversation today and ways that we can think about it and ways that we can work with it, I want us to keep in mind kind of two aspects to conversation. There certainly is the structural elements of conversation. And this morning we're going to be talking about questions and interjections and comments and then ways to put it all together to help students with that natural flow of conversation. But also keep in mind that the reason we have conversation is to interact with people. So there is that important element of when I'm in a conversation with someone, I'm sharing my world with them and I'm entering into their world. And that's a relationship. When we hear a good conversation between people, they're really into it. They're into each other and sharing that information. So it's not just about the structure and can you ask a question and are you following up well, but it's also recognizing that that's where a relationship really takes root, is in our verbal sharing and our conversation with people. So we'll start by thinking about, again, these structural elements of conversation. And we're going to start by talking about questions. Overall this morning, we're really talking about the meaty part of conversation. So we're not so much dealing with the hello and the goodbye, the greetings and the closing. We're really talking about what happens in the middle of a conversation, about the meat of it. And we're going to start our look at that this morning by thinking about questions. Because we know that open-ended questions are really better questions to ask than yes-no questions. They'll move the discussion and the conversation further. But what do you need to know to be able to ask a good question? First of all, you have to process and remember what you've been told, because that's the content from which you're going to draw your question. Second of all, you have to be interested in finding out information. You have to be curious, and you have to be curious about the other person, not just wanting to talk about your agenda. And then finally, you have to have the skill to formulate the question. Certainly one thing we know is that students who don't ask questions of others don't develop the skill of asking questions. And that really makes sense. If you don't do it, you're not going to build this skill set. So if a student is more into bringing the conversation back to their own topic and relating it to themselves rather than finding out more information, they don't ask a lot of questions. We may really need to help them learn how to ask a question. Many students with whom I work on conversation are visual learners, and particularly when we're talking about a skill that may not be very solid, we want to really have visual supports. And so I often have for students a list of question starters, because they may need that. What's the diversity? What are my choices? Now, certainly most of these here are open-ended WH questions. There is a little bit of the did, does, do, are, and is, which tends toward a yes-no question. But those are just included on here. And often I'll say to a student, how about a when question right there? I might give them a hint if I feel that they need a little bit more guidance into what type of question they could be asking. So it's often good to have just a visual support, a list of these question forms. And again, this is a slide from a group with younger students. You can probably see by the subject matter. And these students were talking about they were going to go see a movie, Kung Fu Panda 3. And again, I've used color here. So we've got the fact, the statement in red. What questions could we ask about this particular topic? We could ask a where question. We could ask a when question. We ask, are we going to have lunch after the movie? And then there's questions that we could do during or after as we're planning the event. Do you want to come? What do you want to do after the movie? Have you ever seen Kung Fu Panda or Kung Fu Panda 2? So finding out more information, getting into the details, again, talking about kind of the meat of the conversation, the real discussion where you get things accomplished and move plans forward. And again, whether it's a science project or planning to go to the movies, it's that collaborative discussion. Now, one thing we already talked about is the importance of paying attention. And so here are two examples. So if someone says, I had a terrific lunch with my friend Liz yesterday, and someone says, did you go with your friend? Uh-oh, that is a not so great question. And so I'll often talk about kind of thumbs up or thumbs down questions. Not necessarily a good or a bad question, but not so great because you already know that. I already said I went with my friend Liz. Similarly, if you say, did you like it? Well, you should be able to infer that if you've heard that I had a terrific lunch. That implies that it was a good time. Similarly, with this second example, on Saturday, I'm going to see Zootopia at Northgate with my mom. When are you going? Uh-oh. Again, if you were paying attention, you would have heard and remembered that I already said that I'm doing that on Saturday. And the same thing with the question, who are you going with? Again, that is already known information. What happens if someone asks a question about known information is that the speaker finds it confusing. It's like, didn't I already tell you? There's doubt that enters into the speaker's mind of, I thought I included it, but now you're asking me, so maybe I didn't say it. It can kind of derail the conversation into that confusion, repairs, it disrupts the flow, and it can also kind of make people frustrated. I have a high school group with 5 students, and they've really been working on conversation, but a problem was coming up in that one student was always asking this other student, do you play an instrument? And finally, the other student said, don't you listen? I've told you 5 weeks in a row that I play the clarinet. And so it's that whole issue of paying attention and then also remembering what you've heard. So again, a quick reminder also, as we're kind of modeling and working with question forms and information, often in real life, questions are not said solely as a question. They're embedded in something else. So we want to, as we're working on conversation, move beyond single questions. I can't believe it. My dog got into the garbage yesterday. Yuck! What naughty things does your dog ever do? So again, there's more language to process. And for the student who struggles with language processing, perhaps has an auditory processing problem, or is just inattentive, now they've got to find the question embedded within a bunch of content. Similarly, using multiple questions. Again, we often get more than one question coming our way, and what we're expected to answer both questions. So if I say, where are you going over winter break? Are you gone for the whole time? I've thrown 2 questions at you, and I'm kind of waiting for both questions. If you only answer one of them, then I'm going to be in the position of having to say, so are you gone for the whole time? Again, that slightly derails a conversation and makes me wonder, did I not ask the question? So we really want to, as soon as we can, move into making this a little bit more difficult. We might want to, if we're working on this, say, okay, listen carefully. I'm going to give you a lot of information, then a question. Da-da-da-da-da. Here's my question. So kind of giving that preview. So if as a parent, we're previewing the day and then we know we've got a question, we might want to just take a second and give that little bit of training. I have a lot to say and then I've got a question, so listen up. So that we're kind of giving that suggestion of there's going to be something demanded and requested of you in the end. So please pay attention. So, this morning we're really dashing through a lot of this information. And so now that we're going to actually leave questions and kind of go to the other side of the coin and talk about the answers. And the first thing we're going to address as we're looking at answers and their role in conversation is interjections. Now, what I've found in talking to lots of people about conversation and how you work on conversation is that interjections don't seem to get a lot of attention. And I think that is to the detriment of helping our students sound really good in their conversation. Because if you listen to conversations, if you go home this afternoon and this evening and listen to conversations around you, in the coffee shop, in the supermarket, at home, you're going to hear a surprising number of interjections once you start listening for them. And that's for 2 reasons. First of all, interjections let the speaker know that we are paying attention. And that's very important. And they also communicate that we care because they are little empathic markers that we pop in. Now, that means that you have to have perspective taking. If I say, my husband and I made ravioli last night, you could say, yum, because you've gotten from my tone that it was a positive thing. But if I say, my husband and I made ravioli last night, you can tell from my intonation that there was something wrong. And you might say, oh no, what happened? If you struggle with perspective taking and understanding the feeling state of the other person, you will struggle with interjections and with matching the correct interjection. So how do we address interjections? Again, we're going to supply a visual support. And this is a list that's in the UQ Feelings book, because at the end, We talk a lot about with feelings the importance of interjections. So here's a list. Now, when you look at this, you will see that some of these interjections are not used in your community. They're just not part of your culture. So it's a very eclectic list here. Your culture may use ooh la la, or they may not. And so what you want to do is kind of condense this list into the conjunctions that are part of your culture, part of what you hear students saying, part of what's used in your family circle. And again, in my practice, we call these pop-ins. We don't call them interjections because that's just no fun to remember. But I call them pop-ins because you just pop them in. They're not a whole sentence. You don't give a whole, oh, wow, that sounds like really a lot of fun because my family and I have made ravioli too. No. It's just a wow or a cool or a all right or a yum. It's a very quick little pop-in, but again, it's a very, very powerful part of conversation. So often I'll work with students on you've got to get that pop-in before you make a comment or you ask a question, that it's really, really important. And often students will have a list for a while. They may need to work again with how do you pair the correct interjection with the correct intonation in what the person said that tells you the feeling. And then they'll kind of have, a short list of ones that they like and that sound natural coming from them. And then that becomes a useful and more automatic part of their conversation. All right, so we've zipped through questions and interjections, and now we're going to work and talk about comments. Because a comment is not necessarily an answer to a question. It is a comment. And so oftentimes what I find is, particularly if a therapist is working on conversation, they'll work on that question-answer dynamic. The problem with that is that really good conversations and conversations that, again, really have that relationship feel to them are based more in comments and having comments back and forth, in one person adding information and then the other person adding their own take on it. So it's really that back and forth with commentary. Again, that's something we may need to work with. And so here are two visuals from a group that I had. And so let's look at the slide on the left first. And so Callum was giving a little narrative, and he talked about going to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, I'm in Northern California, and staying at a hotel and having room service. And the structure of this practice was that the other three members of the group needed to make a comment, not ask a question, because certainly you could say, what did you get from room service? Did you see the octopus at the aquarium? But in this structured work, we were working on comments. And what we see is that these comments are really lovely. So Claire says, I've been to Monterey. Fabulous information. Anna says, I bet the aquarium had some great sea animals. That's kind of an indirect question, but it's phrased as a comment. And Mark says, I've been to the aquarium with my father. So now you can imagine that in group, this was really becoming that collaborative discussion that people are really looking for now in the classroom, that teachers are wanting. Let's look at the slide at the visual on the right. And so Anna talked about that she had a party at the clubhouse at her complex, and she went swimming and they had food. So again, lots of great conversational bait. But again, we're working on comments. And Claire says, I had a party a while back at House of Air. Now, just looking at that from a language viewpoint, this is a fabulous comment because Claire has put a really nice time marker in there of a while back. Callum adds his little informative plug. I go swimming at a private pool we share with people who live in Pacheco Valley. Terrific. And Mark says, I used to go swimming at the Presidio. So again, this is really starting to sound like it could be a great collaborative discussion. So now let's turn to how we can put all of this information that we've gone through quickly together. What I started doing and playing around with was making conversation maps, because I wanted to give kids a structure to follow without at all giving them a script, which is a little bit tricky. But this is an example of a conversational map where one student would be green and one student would be that attractive, not a burgundy, not an orange. You can pick your word for that color. And so on the bottom, there would be a sample that students could read. So the comment, Lego Marvel's Avengers is a great game. Another comment, Force Awakens is going to be better, coming out in summer. Now the green conversationalist has to have a pop-in and a question. Sweet, are you going to get it? Answer plus question. Maybe for my birthday, you going to get it? For sure. That's actually a pop-in. Know what movie I saw this weekend? And so there's that bridge. So this is a relatively sophisticated conversation map. Simpler ones would just have question, answer, comment. They might be just a conversational map of 3. And what I found is that initially this is challenging for students because they're not used to having it be so free form. They're used to it being much more laid out for them. But if you've worked on your questions and answers, then they're ready to do the question-answer map. If you've worked with pop-ins, and you might have that list of pop-ins right there, then when they see pop-in plus question, they're more ready to handle that. And certainly it can be slow in the beginning as they're finding their way. But what I found is that even younger students, even students who might be in 3rd grade, can learn to follow and successfully complete a much more complicated conversation map. And so I've kind of been playing around with this idea. I'm thinking about making it perhaps a game or a material that could be available so that, again, you can learn to diversify. You can always just make little pieces of paper and lay them out so that students can practice. Now, this might not be something that a parent and child could do successfully, especially in a moment of stress. But if you can think of it as a game, and certainly I think in an academic setting, it might be a little bit more easy to introduce to students. Parents, we probably want to do something a little bit more like that previewing I mentioned before. I'm going to tell you something about my day, and I bet you can come up with a question to ask. And then to give the student, some information about my day. I think often as parents, we don't talk about our experiences so much as we want to talk about the child's experiences. And that's certainly understandable and relevant. But remember that if we want a child to work on conversation skills, it's also about asking the other person about their experiences. And so it's fair game to say, I had lunch with an old friend today. And, try and get your child to ask you a question about it or to do a pop-in or something. Again, it's that balanced conversation about learning to talk about the other. So as we're talking about remembering what we know about the other, now I had given that example of the student who kept forgetting that the group member played the saxophone and it was driving everybody crazy. Especially as students get older, we want them to remember what they know about people. This is that whole idea of a friend file. That when I know that a friend of mine is allergic to fish, I'm not going to ask them if they want to go out for sushi. They're not going to take kindly to that question because part of them was going to think, don't you remember I have these incredible fish allergies? And so what we talked about, this is a slide from a high school group. So for Jules, instead of saying what's new, which is a very pat question, and it kind of puts a lot of onus on the other person to think of something that's new and interesting and entertaining to provide. What can you do? What can you remember? And base your question on that. So if Jules can remember that the other person takes karate, he can ask, how's karate? Did you get a new belt? Now that's really letting the other person know that you remember about them, that you really care about them. Again, that relationship element to conversations. So if Steve remembers that his friend likes video games, instead of even saying, what video game do you like? Take it a step further. Did you get Civ 6 yet? Again, that's almost picking up a conversation where it left off the time before. It's really remembering the content of previous conversations. Again, that question, how's school? Well, the standard answer to that is, I guess it's okay. It's not the most interesting topic. We certainly know as parents, asking, how was school today is not really an uber great question to get a really exciting answer from. So if Charles can remember that Jules is in an architecture AP class, he could say, have you built a model house in your architecture class? That is a wonderful question. Jules is happy to hear it because, again, he really likes his AP architecture class. And then that actually, when this happened in group, started out the conversation on a really wonderful course. And so this particular high school group, after this experience, we really talked about, wow, you guys are in your IEPs. Could this become a goal? And just students came up with this fabulous, based on what he remembers about another student's interests in life. So-and-so will include at least one substantive, relevant question or comment in 3 out of 4 engagement he has with peers he sees regularly. This goal really is moving far from that 80% accuracy goal that we used to see in lots of IEPs. And just as a reminder, when we're starting to talk about relationships and social thinking and social cognition, we really have to rethink how we're writing goals, because you can't say that so-and-so will start a conversation 80% of the time. That is not a measurable goal. It doesn't work that way. So we have to be able to think much more carefully about what is it that we want to accomplish when we write a goal, so that it's measurable and accurate, so that it really addresses the issues that the particular student with whom we're working is dealing with. And as parents, to go to IEP meetings and look at goals and say, how are you going to measure this? And perhaps, ask some questions and ask for clarification. If you feel that a goal is very general and you can think, I don't know how I would measure that, you can ask, how would you do that? Is there another way we can frame this goal so that it's understandable to everyone what it is that we're looking for? So when we're working on conversation, again, the more interesting we can make it, the more students are going to want to participate. And this goes whether you're doing conversational maps or just having students practice conversation or working on a conversation. And so here is just a list of topics that students who I work with enjoy talking about. I mean, we can have a great conversation about Amazon shopping. I've got my computer here. We need a new game. Let's get online and let's see what looks good to you guys. Again, if we think back to that classroom performance, we're really going to be looking for those collaborative discussions. And so building projects, building obstacle courses or Rube Goldberg machines. Again, if you're doing any kind of construction work at home with putting kits together or doing any of the Lego, machinery building, that's a great opportunity to work on that collaboration. And if you have a child who maybe, has trouble staying regulated, taking in that input, you can always do that preview of, okay, we're going to build this model. So, let's just quickly make a list of what it means to collaborate. It means we're really going to listen to each other. Okay, we've got to remember to do that. All right, we've got to be flexible. Yeah, that can be hard sometimes. And, to really help students understand everything that goes into that collaborative discussion. Back to that slide we had in the beginning of this presentation about what are the aspects of collaboration. It's a very broad list. And some students will have particular elements that they struggle with. Often with students, I also will have these little written out thought bubbles about, it's okay, I can be flexible. That's a good idea also. Because many of our students don't have that internalized yet. Their first reaction is to argue, or their first reaction is to challenge, or their first reaction is to bring the attention back to their idea. And so again, you can think about, does this student need some visual supports? Might those be helpful? So this is just a list of topics to think about. Now, with the advent, of course, of phones, there are lots of, I'm a slide ahead. So we also want to work on specific types of conversations. So we've talked a little bit about joint activities already, but there's also misunderstandings and arguments. So there's lots of different ways that we communicate through conversation. So, for example, when we talk about arguing and making mistakes, I'll often, again, make these backstories for groups to practice. You and your friends are getting ready for a study. You're going to get together for a study group. You were supposed to bring cookies, but you forgot. Or you were supposed to bring cookies and your mom didn't have time to make them or get them at the store. How are you going to handle that conversationally? And this particular first one was a very interesting one because the issue came up of, well, it's not my fault if my mother didn't have time to make the cookies. But the other students are going to say, where are the cookies? Why didn't you bring them? Part of what you need to do is apologize, even though it is not you who failed. But you have to take that onus on that you are in part responsible for not having cookies. And, working on apologies and accepting apologies is super duper important because, again, that's a conversational form. Now, texting, again, is a form of conversation that many of our students engage in. And again, the same rules apply, and we may have to work with them on their texting. Process the information you're given. Share interesting information. Ask questions. And again, show that you care. So here are a couple of screenshots of students in groups working on texting each other. And they're really doing a good job of asking for clarification, giving good information. You see it pop in, cool and nice. So they're doing a good job with that. I'll often offer students texting practice ideas, and they can be very general, such as you're going to meet at In-N-Out Burger for lunch, set a date and time. That's all they have to do, and I've had students who agreed to meet once at 11:30, and the other student said, sure, I'll see you at 12. They're not paying attention to what is on their screens, and that is not going to work out well at In-N-Out. You can make it more open-ended. You're just going to text back and forth. And as parents, we can practice texting with our students. Or even a challenge of just saying you need to text with so-and-so and just set something up. So they have to make all of the decisions. And as parents, again, often we will embed a question in a text or ask two questions. I remember with my son, I would text him two questions and I'd only get the answer back to one. And it's like, I asked two questions. I really need all of this information. So that can be very, very helpful. So just some final thoughts. We've kind of done this mad dash through conversation. Is, again, remember that there are lots of different ways that we use conversation. And so think about all the different ways we use it to communicate information, to work on projects, to argue, to patch up a misunderstanding. If you want to practice conversation in a more structured way, make it fun. Make the activity fun. Make sure you have a lot of visuals. Because, again, conversation is very complicated for students with ADHD. There's a lot for them to track. And if we have those visuals, those questions, those pop-ins, that will be very helpful to them in then feeling more confident and wanting to participate in the activity. And of course, we have to be patient. This is a very, very challenging skill. And we all know adults in our worlds who are not good conversationalists. And so, it's really a continuum. And what we want to do is just help our students move forward in their conversation skills. So thank you all for listening. Wayne, I'm going to turn it back over to you and see if there are any questions coming in.
Yes, we have some very good questions in need of your answers. So here we go.
Oh, okay.
Sarah,
I'll try to answer.
All right. How do you increase motivation in kids who don't seem interested in other children's perspectives and opinions beyond what coincides with their own specific and not necessarily shared interests? So is there any... Oh, go ahead.
Well, I think part of it is finding kind of a middle ground of a material that is engaging, but also that the other person has something to do with. I have a chart that I use in my office when we work on shared imagination. And at the bottom of the chart, it says, we're all kind of doing our own thing in our own way by ourselves. And then there's a midpoint that says good, that says we're trying to work together, but it's hard to be flexible. And then at the top, it's got yay. we're sharing imagination and being flexible. And so part of that, I think part of that question hinges on that flexibility. And so what you might want to try is to do something more structured. So student A gets to talk about what he likes, and the other person has to practice a question. And then you reverse it, and the other student talks about what they like, and now this student who really likes to talk about their own thing, wow, can you ask 2 questions? And start out perhaps, it's hard for me to know what situation we're talking about. That's how I would do it in a group, is to structure it and then have a great reward. And then have, wow, we've done all this work on conversation. Now we're going to play a video game, or we're going to play something fun. And so we're really building in that student that knowledge, because often students, they don't ask the questions because they don't really know how. And it's really trying to engage them, and you can get better at this. But also to say it can be hard to listen to somebody else. Wow, you might feel kind of bored or kind of challenged in your attention, because we all know that when we go to a cocktail party, we're the most interesting person there. And what we have to say is the most interesting. And so we have to learn to give the other person time. And that's part of what we're doing when we work on conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's excellent advice. Another parent with another practical question. As a parent, how do I find an expert in my area to help our son work on conversational language? A speech language therapist or someone else?
I think this falls under the auspices of a speech-language pathologist more than anyone else, if we're talking about a professional. And so I would look at the speech-language pathologists in your area, and you're looking for somebody who understands the complexities of conversation and who probably has a good foundation in social cognition and social thinking. Because again, so much of conversation is based in perspective taking, understanding feeling states. When I use some of the activities from my UQ Feelings book, because I'm into, using media and YouTube, we'll look at a YouTube video and we might talk about the feelings. And so one really terrific one, I love using this one in my book, is Sesame Street, Ernie Counts Fruit, because this is one about conversation and also flexibility. Ernie is counting fruit, and so he doesn't listen to Bert, and Bert keeps trying to get his attention to start, to have a conversation with him, and Ernie really is not paying attention. And so Bert starts getting frustrated. And so we can show this to young students and say, wow, what's happening with their conversation? I've had very young kids say, Ernie's just not caring about his friend. Because conversation is a lot about caring about the other person. And so I think often we can use YouTube examples to show either a conversation that works, where people or characters are really engaged, and see, wow, look at how much they cared about each other. Look at how their conversation went back and forth, and they both feel so good about it. Versus a conversation like what Ernie and Bert have in this example, where you can say, well, Ernie's feeling okay the whole time. He's doing his thing, and Bert starts out okay, but then he gets frustrated, and he actually gets kind of a little furious, although he contains it. And so how do we handle feelings when people aren't listening to us?
Yeah. Several questions about, it's sort of keying into what you just said. Can you recommend any social skills software or apps or even board games that will help my 9-year-old daughter become a better conversationalist?
Oh, that's a challenging one for me. I don't. There is Conversation Builder, which is an app that I think is great, and I've used it a lot. Sometimes I'll modify it because it gives, there's a part of it where it gives the student choices of things to say, and so I'll often cover that so that there's a little bit more spontaneity. But I think that's a great place to start. There's there's Conversation Builder, the basic one. I don't have it in front of me. And then there's one for older students. So there's 2 different ones. And there may even be another one out right now. I haven't checked in a while. And so I think that's a really good one. The challenge with having games or apps is that we really want to stay away from scripting because that isn't what we want. Oftentimes, the materials that I see that are about conversation have these lists of topics or these topic cards. And sometimes there's something like, if you could be an animal, what animal would you be? Now, Stuart, if you and I were going to have a conversation about that, I just don't think it'd be very interesting. And I have yet to find students of any age who actually want to have a conversation about what animal they would like to be. You know, I have a lot of boys in my practice. Maybe girls could get by with unicorns and puppies, but, you know, the boys are just not going to go there. And so I think a lot of these question starters are not so relevant. And so I think looking more toward what are these kids interested in? Are they all talking about Minecraft? Then you can talk about Minecraft. You know, part of it also then perhaps is when you mentioned, I don't know any board games necessarily for conversation, but just looking at turn taking in general, and turn taking even with something like video games. Because when you take a turn with video games, how do you still stay engaged and caring about the other person? So if it's not my turn at mini golf, I use a lot of Connect sports games because I think they're fabulous for groups. So if someone else is standing up doing the mini golf and I'm on the couch, my job is still to be conversant and engaged about the other person. I'm either cheering them on or I'm encouraging them, or if I'm an older student, I'm kind of perhaps teasing them a little bit without crossing that line into mean. But I'm actively engaged. I'm not just staring out the window waiting for my turn to come back. So I think it's also about teaching that staying engaged in the moment.
Right. It's funny, I was going to just ask a question, but someone that's similar in tone to what this parent has asked, Dom. What suggestions do you have to help a child become more sensitive in their response or questions? My child is brutally honest with people. Yeah, I had a question about from another parent who said, my daughter sees conversations as a litmus test of a person's authenticity or character. If she hears something that isn't true or exaggerated or that she disagrees with, she will speak up loudly and sometimes insultingly. Many kids diagnosed with ADHD have problems with controlling their emotions, and some get angry easily.
Right.
How am I able to talk her, out of this and soften her approach?
That's a really fabulous question because of that impulse control and that I have to tell you that you're wrong tendency of so many students with ADHD. And, you know, my answer is going to go to where I often go when I'm talking about anything that has to do with social, and that's to bring it back down to feeling state. So if I say something and I'm and someone is brutally honest, a question could be, can you tell how I'm feeling about that? Can you tell how that made me feel? And to take a moment and try and have our face communicate that feeling state of hurt feelings or sadness. And again, give that student a little extra time to process that, because they may not be used to picking up that I look hurt. Oftentimes, we'll have that come over our face very fleetingly, or as parents, we don't even show it. But that's what's so important is, wow, did you notice that what you said made my feeling change? Because there isn't that desire to hurt my feelings. They're just being brutally honest. But learning that brutal honesty needs to be tempered a little bit. And that comes down to, wow, when you interrupted me to tell me a little factoid that I perhaps didn't include, can you tell how that made me feel? So that's about feelings and also perspective taking. And so often that takes a little bit of time to work through. I certainly wouldn't do it out in public where it can be embarrassing. You could perhaps, if you notice something on a play date or, out in the community, you could a little bit later sketch it out and draw a quick little picture of here you are with your friend, and your friend's talking about that they got polka dot shoes for their birthday present and they really love them. And you say, well, polka dots are really out fashion-wise. How did that make your friend feel? Can you tell how she might have felt? Oh, wow. And then start talking about redos. Well, I wonder how could you have redone that? Or if it's with you and your child, oh, wow, yeah, you figured out that kind of hurt my feelings. Should we do a redo on that? Should we try that again? Give them another opportunity. The other issue that comes up here is that when, that brutal honesty is very direct, and what develops from a very early age in a lot of neurotypicals is that understanding of indirectness. So indirectness is used to save face so that people don't get embarrassed and don't feel bad. But linguistically, that's a very sophisticated thing to do, to be able to be indirect, to kind of hint. Most students with ADHD are not very good at indirectness. They are direct. And so again, it may be working with, again, getting back to, how do you think that made me feel? Can you think of a different way of saying that would temper it a little bit, that would make it be, perhaps you're giving the same information, but you're doing it in a much more gentle way. And so that indirectness is a huge, huge challenge because of that tendency toward impulsivity and that black and white. I have to tell you the truth, black and white. Right. You're wrong.
Richard, a dad, asks, my son starts out great in conversations, but his low self-esteem derails him. He starts to drift away from what his peers are saying and thinks that no one is interested in what he has to say. So is there any way to redirect him? I mean, I think this is a larger issue, but I just wondered if you had any practical suggestions on how we can keep this child's, focus on the conversation and not so much on his self-esteem or his lack of it.
Well, I wonder, Richard, if part of what your son is facing is that he's also getting tired of the processing load, especially if it's in a group of friends. So remember that the more people that are in the conversation, the more challenging it is. And that perhaps he starts out strong, but then as the conversation starts to drift, from one topic to the next, because conversations often go all over the map, that then he's perhaps wanting to focus more on where the conversation started and having trouble tracking where it's going. And so then he gets to that point of, I'm just going to kind of withdraw a little bit. And then that kind of is feeding that I'm not very good at this, so I'm going to kind of pull back. And I think it is a much broader issue. I think perhaps if you could get him into situations where he's perhaps with only one other child and see how is he there? Is he staying with it longer? Is he more engaged? Is he more animated? Does he feel like he's more on top of things? Because the challenge may also be the size of the group, that the bigger is, even with a group of two others, then you have to track from one to the next. And similarly, a group may unwittingly start to exclude those students who aren't keeping up as much. And so if I'm talking to two people and one person is asking me questions and comments, that conversation will end up looking like a conversation between only two people with a third person who's out. And that may be part of the dynamic also, is that the group then is morphing and shifting and starting to have a core within the group, and that your son ends up drifting to the perimeter because of a number of issues. So I think it's very, very complicated.
But that's a good point about group conversations and three turning into two. That's very interesting.
Right.
I've seen that. Auditory processing challenges. Can this be part of a problem with conversation?
Absolutely. It's very difficult if you have an auditory processing disorder to track a conversation, especially if you think about even just what is the ambient noise. If you're out on the playground, oh my gosh, and there's a lunch table with 5 kids sitting at it having lunch, you may have all the background noise of the other kids on the blacktop. You may have all of the crinkling of the paper and the lunch stuff. Then you've got a ball bouncing. So absolutely. Auditory processing can make it very difficult to follow a conversation. And again, that's where starting with a very small, with one other conversational partner where there isn't a lot of background noise can be very, very helpful. And again, those visual supports will also help that student because then you're supplying them with what they may need visually. Often when I work on conversation, we'll work on it in writing first. So I may have students, if I have 4 kids in a group, and everyone writes out a 6-second story, which is from Story Grammar Marker. It's a way of kind of giving a bunch of great information about who did what, where, and when. They write it out, pass the marker board to the student on your right, and they have to read it, and they write a question, and they pass it back, and you write the answer, and you do this board passing. And so that's a way of working on conversation, removing, first of all, the whole auditory processing component. Also removing that interpersonal load, which can be stressful. Also removing the fact that spoken language vanishes. And so often, and we had several examples today about working on conversation through written form, because that can also really help students with auditory processing difficulties. That way you're kind of isolating working on conversation without the auditory processing component.
Really good advice there. Really good. One quick last question on pop-ins and interjections. A couple of parents asked, can you overuse them to the point where it might derail a conversation?
Yes. Cool.
Right.
Yes,
right.
you can. They're pop-ins. They're not like pop all the times. So, yes. Or students will sometimes start the pop-in before the person has finished. Because they've already figured out it was cool. So they want to get that in. So, yes.
How can a parent walk that back? Any just say, listen a little more closely? Or, I mean, I don't know.
Well, you could say, whoa, you're just peppering me with pop-ins. Or just say, wow, they're just coming at me. Maybe just, you don't have to do this so much. I have the same thing come up with compliments. I've worked with students on giving compliments, and next thing you know, they see me and, oh, Anna, I like your jeans, I like your shoes, I like your scarf. It's like, okay, thanks. So it is, you're right, we don't want too much of a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I think we're just about out of time, and I know I found it very valuable. I thought you were terrific, and the advice was outstanding, and we can all take it into our...
We went through a lot. There was a lot of information, so
right.
I hope it wasn't too much.
No, it was great. It was just right. So thanks again, Anna, for your expertise and being with us. And once again, the sponsor of this week's Attitude webinar is Play Attention. Play Attention is the only brain training system that combines both advanced neurofeedback and cognitive training to effectively improve attention, processing, behavior, and learning skills in children and adults with ADHD. Improvement in these areas can help you or your child develop better communication skills. Play Attention can customize a program for you. Contact them at 800-788-6786 or www.playattention.com. And have a good day, everyone.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.
I have diabetes. I'm at risk for pneumococcal pneumonia.
I have asthma. I'm at risk too.
If you're 19 or older with chronic conditions like asthma, diabetes, COPD, or heart disease, or are 65 or older, you are at increased risk for pneumococcal pneumonia. Ask your doctor or pharmacist about Prevnar 20, pneumococcal 20-valent conjugate vaccine, a Pfizer vaccine that can help protect you against pneumococcal pneumonia in just one dose. Even if you've already been vaccinated with other pneumonia vaccines, Prevnar 20 may help provide added protection. Prevnar 20 is approved for adults to help prevent infections from 20 strains of the bacteria that cause pneumococcal pneumonia. Continued approval may depend on a supportive study. Don't get Prevnar 20 if you've had a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine or its ingredients. Adults with weakened immune systems may have a lower response to the vaccine. Side effects include pain and swelling at the injection site, fatigue, headache, muscle, and joint pain. For full prescribing information, please call 1-855-213-2138 or visit Prevnar20.com.